Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 114 Global Moral Issues, where today we are continuing our discussion of environmental ethics, and in particular, looking at the moral status of animals and asking which sorts of things can have moral status, that is, which sorts of things are worthy of moral consideration. So, for this lecture, we're going to briefly recap some of the vocab from the intro. That is, we're going to make sure we've got the labels for the positions down so that we can talk about them in greater detail. And then essentially, we're going to tackle them in order, same as we presented them last time. We're going to first talk briefly about anthropocentrism, the intuitive response of a lot of people and a few different philosophical theorists. We're going to talk about zoocentrism and its most famous advocate, Peter Singer, who is currently living in a contemporary philosopher on this topic and is very well known in the area. And we'll talk a little bit about animal rights and species egalitarianism. And we'll close out with a brief look at biocentrism as an alternative to the other two views. So let's get to it, shall we? So we're focusing on environmental ethics with this unit. That is, we're focusing in particular on questions of moral status and how it relates and how it changes the way that we approach moral problems involving the environment. Now, as I just said, the main issue for us is a question of moral status. That is, we're looking at which sorts of things are worthy of moral consideration. And when we talk about this moral consideration, there are two different sorts that we might mean. We might mean direct moral consideration, where things worthy of moral concern for its own sake, or we might be talking about indirect moral consideration, where something's worthy of moral concern for the sake of its relationship to something else. Now, as far as possible answers to our question, there are three different positions to consider: anthropocentrism, zoocentrism, and biocentrism, which simply are being human focused, animal focused, and life focused, if we literally look at the terms themselves. So this means the idea that only humans have moral status, that animals have moral status, both human and non human, and then finally the position that all living things are worthy of moral concern. It's also worth noting that moral status can come in degrees. So even if we adopt something like zoocentrism or biocentrism, it's not an automatic answer to the question of how much moral status should be given to each of these. We can't automatically say that, oh, well, animals deserve moral status, but it should be less than ours, or it should be equal to ours. This is a further question that ought to be answered in addition to whether or not animals have moral status at all in the first place. But a little bit of the vocab down, let's ask a brief sort of question originally framed as a story. Suppose that you were walking down the shores of the Wabash River. It's a little cold for that these days, now that autumn is finally actually setting in. But suppose you're walking down along the shores of the Wabash River, and you see two different figures drowning. One is an obvious human child, say about 8 or 9 years old. A kid. A kid is literally drowning in the river. And a little ways down, but somewhat further away, is, say, a dog, a bit over a year old, drowning there in the river. Both of them are struggling. Both of them are in desperate need of help and assistance, and both are just far enough out and far enough away from each other that if you or anyone were to do something, were to try and save them, you had to pick one to save. You can't choose both. You have to choose one or the other if you do anything at all. And you're the only one around, the only one who has enough time and is close enough to try and save one of their two lives. So, here's your question then. Which of the two should you save? Not just would. We're not worried about what people would do. Remember, ethics is a normative subject. But I'm curious, which one do you think you have an obligation to save? Do you have an obligation to save either of them? Should you choose one or the other? Now, taking a moment to think about this, I think, is actually interesting because once you think about what your response is, I think that can tell us some interesting things about our problem. See, for many of us, the natural and intuitive response is to, of course, save the human being, save the child. For one, that seems just the obvious choice to a lot of us. And so at that point, if it does seem intuitive and obvious, the philosophical question is why? Rather than saying, what should you do in this situation? Why is it the right situation? Why is it the right choice for the situation? What's the explanation? What moral theory can adequately explain what's going on in this sort of choice? And this is the sort of idea that sits behind most anthropocentric views. Uh, Generally, we can safely assume that if morality exists at all, if any kind of moral realism or objectivism is true, then human beings have some kind of moral status. And that we can safely take as a given without having to do too much of an argument for it. But just because we don't have to argue that human beings have moral status doesn't mean that there aren't questions to be answered and theories to be evaluated. The basis of that status still matters very much because depending on why human beings have moral status, our answers to the previous dilemma, this, may not actually make so much sense anymore. Because, for example, many moral theories argue that human beings have some sort of a property or a capacity that makes us special in some way. We might say that human beings are rational, autonomous. Some of us might say that human beings are made in the image of God, or that we have souls, or that we have language, or whatever else, that we create beautiful works of art, that we can stand in complex social relationships. All of these are options for saying why human beings have moral status. But for one, it seems odd to cite that as a reason for saying that, oh, because that kid over there is a rational thinker, he's worth my focus more than the dog is. For one, that line of thinking seems a little bit odd, but also proving and establishing that that's true is a rather difficult proposition at times. If we want to say that, for example, human beings have souls, and that this is what makes a human being different than a dog drowning in the river, and that it's because the human being has a soul that I should choose the human over the animal, meaning the non human animal. Proving that, philosophically speaking, is rather difficult. It's not like we have to worry about finding physical proof necessarily, but good arguments and good reasons that stand up to criticism can be hard to come by for some of these. And even if we do have good arguments for this sort of thing, if we want to support an anthropocentric view and say to choose the human over the non human animal, then showing that the other sort of creature or that other non human creatures in general don't have this sort of quality, that can be difficult. Now, if you're successful at both of these two tasks, then we have some sort of good basis for anthropocentrism. We can give some sort of a foundation for saying that no, only human beings are worthy of moral concern. But many, many other non human creatures share a lot of the traits that traditional theories look to. Most theories for anthropocentrism look to one of the qualities that I cite here on the slide. Things like being rational or autonomous, being made in the image of God, having souls, and so on. But with the exception of the more supernatural theories like image of God or having souls or something like that, other species like elephants, dolphins, and chimps have many of these qualities. For example, dolphins and many primates are quite intelligent and, in fact, can match up against, excuse me, um, primates and dolphins can match up with human children as far as problem solving goes. And if we're talking about kids drowning in the river, then those other creatures have the same sort of capacities We know that those two, along with elephants, all have the capacity for language. They have complex social dynamics, that they can problem solve and come up with new and creative solutions to various difficulties. So we know that other creatures have many of the same properties that we do. So a lot of the basis for anthropocentrism on its own faces some significant challenges, to say the least. There are things that have to be considered when trying to establish or argue for anthropocentrism. Additionally, it's worth pointing out that depending on which theory is chosen or how it's argued for, excuse me, depending on the view that one's arguing for, which is not just a matter of choice or style or anything like that. It ought to be because you think it's the best explanation for what's going on. But depending on what sort of criterion is chosen, some human beings might not make the cut for moral status either. For example, if we say that having a certain level of capacity for rational thought is the thing that makes human beings special and worthy of moral consideration, we do have to start worrying about the elderly, the very young, the cognitively disabled, those who are atypical, neurologically speaking. There are many different people and situations. Oh, excuse me, I don't know why I'm yawning. There may be human beings who don't quite meet the same threshold or criteria that we might cite for having moral status. And that seems wrong in many ways. It would seem like it would go against many of our considered moral judgments if we ended up adopting some sort of moral theory that says that only healthy, neurally typical human beings are the ones worthy of moral consideration. That those that are young, elderly, disabled, or otherwise may not deserve moral consideration at all. And that seems just absurd on a few different levels. So, establishing a strong argument for anthropocentrism is difficult, to say the least. Now, one of our alternatives would be to start considering another view, that of zoocentrism, and sort of expand the circle of moral concern to start including non human animals, where we start including different creatures as also being worthy of moral concern, as also having significant places in our moral thinking. Now, this sort of position can solve a few of the issues with anthropocentrism we were just talking about. If we're looking to one of these sorts of traits, having rational capacities for thought, for being able to stand in complex social relationships, for having capacity for language, if this seems like the right sort of basis for having moral status, but it seems problematic when we're sort of picking and choosing which sort of creatures count. If we're more consistently allow for non-human animals to be included, they can avoid some of the objections to this sort of position. However, there are still some theoretical costs with this. We can't simply expand the circle of concern, so to speak, without having some sort of a theoretical cost to pay. And when I talk about this as a theoretical cost, I don't mean that someone literally has to pay something or that there are massive just issues or downsides to the theory. It's not just that. When I talk about theoretical costs, I talk about, or what I mean is that there are implications of the theory that are worth considering whether or not we ought to endorse them. For example, if a theory ends up implying something absolutely false, like if there was some theory of science that said that gravity makes things fall upwards, well, we know that that theory is absolutely bogus because things don't fall upwards. Any theory that implies that objects fly upwards off of the ground just on their own because of gravity, well, that's a crazy theory. It just isn't true. It implies something false. Similarly, I'll get over this. Similarly, philosophical theories sometimes can imply different positions or uh, different ideas that we might have good reason to reject. And if that's the case, the fact that they imply it might be a reason to not endorse that theory. Because just like things flying upwards against gravity, it might lead us to believe ridiculous things. One possible candidate for all of this, one possible cost, theoretical cost attached to zoocentrism, is that there still are some further unsolved questions and unintuitive results that we have to tackle and deal with if we simply try and expand the circle of concern to include non human animals. For one, we have to start wondering on how the moral status of non human animals relates and fits with that of human beings. Is it the same? Is it different? Should we be egalitarians or non egalitarians? We might still go back to our original question and say that even if you're a zoocentrist and you say that, oh, Fido over here deserves moral consideration, we might still be tempted to say that we should save the human first. And we now have the question, well, why? If they both have moral status, shouldn't it be just as viable to choose the dog instead? And for many of us, that seems unintuitive. It seems not just difficult to believe, but perhaps ridiculous to believe that that's a possible option. And additionally, if we treat human or non human animals as being worthy of moral concern, that means that many of the things that we currently do and include in our Western lifestyle would have to change quite a bit. Uh, Westerners consume far more meat than zoocentrism might imply on its own. If non human animals have the same moral status as human beings, then eating the flesh of a non human animal might be morally equivalent to eating another human being. Chemically, it's not the case. We can safely eat the flesh of non human animals, but morally speaking, that may be a belief or a position that we have to reconsider if we endorse zoocentrism. So there are costs and downsides associated with the theory, things that we need to be aware of, and that ought to be deeply considered as either being worth endorsing or not. Now, that's not to say automatically, though, that zoocentrism faces the exact same problems as anthropocentrism. Some of those issues are things that plague anthropocentrism as well. But another option is to stress the degree of moral status and have a different sort of zoocentrism. And this is where we get something like Immanuel Kant's theory, which is briefly discussed in one of the readings, the overview reading for the chapter. Now, Kantian style theories might argue that non human animals are worthy of indirect moral concern, but not direct moral concern, and thus they're worthy of a somewhat lesser moral status. Kant argued that overall non human animals are important to our moral thinking. That is, they have a place in the sorts of things we consider, and they ought to be included when we're trying to decide what the right thing to do is. But it's not because they intrinsically have the same sorts of things going on that humans do. Instead, Kant argued that animals have moral status or worthy of moral concern because of a certain sort of relationship to us. See, Kant, who was an 18th century German philosopher, argued that we don't actually have any moral obligations to non human animals. That is, we don't have duties to them the same way that we might have duties to human beings around us. There is no duty, thou shalt not kill a sheep or a cow or something, according to Kant. But Kant did say that we should not abuse or mistreat animals around us, especially not for any sort of important cause. But it's not because the animals themselves had rights or dignity or something else that had to be respected. Instead, Kant thought that it was bad for us as moral beings to act that way. Essentially, Kant argued that human beings have moral status because of our rational and moral capacities. Human beings can act morally, rationally, and freely. Animals can't. So they can't have the same status as us. They lack the same foundation of moral worth that human beings have. But if we were to start mistreating animals in regular ways, that makes it easier for us to mistreat human beings. It's the same sort of idea of serial killers or sociopaths. Once you start abusing animals in certain ways, once you start treating them with cruelty or failing to regard them morally, that makes it easier for you to not regard human beings morally. It's essentially practice at being evil in a certain way. It's training and developing habits that really are terrible for us as moral creatures. So Kant says we should treat animals with respect, but not because of anything about the animals themselves. Rather, when push comes to shove, the more important thing is that we worry about humans, including what we're doing to ourselves when we treat animals in certain ways. So animals are worth moral consideration. In a very odd sort of sense, Kant might be considered a zoocentrist, but he would definitely argue that they're only worthy of indirect moral concern. That is, that they only ought to be worried about because of their relationship to something else, namely us and each other. Now, another zoocentrist, Peter Singer, who is a contemporary animal rights activist and ethicist and utilitarian overall. Singer takes a very different sort of argument. Singer's argument is essentially a consequentialist one. It's the way he approaches most moral problems. He looks to the consequences of an action to explain whether or not it's right or wrong. Now, Singer, following Jeremy Bentham, says that the right thing to do in any given situation is to promote well-being and minimize suffering and unhappiness and that sort of thing. But if that's the case, then what matters isn't whether or not non-human animals are rational, but rather whether or not animals can suffer. And he literally states as much in the essay that you should have already taken a look at by this point. See, Singer argues that we ought to treat all pain and suffering in the world equally. It is, just like we say that my suffering is just important as yours, or that a stranger's suffering is just as important as a family member's or a friend's suffering, at least when we look at things objectively. Singer would argue that non-human suffering is just as important as human suffering. So long as it's not tied to producing some greater good, it ought to be avoided, if at all possible. And so Singer would say that because of that, because the criterion is whether or not something suffers as the important deciding factor for moral status, that for one, we ought to adopt some form of zoocentrism. Animals deserve a place in our moral thinking. And two, we ought to immediately change how we react and relate to animals. We ought to treat them in the same sorts of ways that we would human beings, at least morally speaking. So in a way, Singer's theory is a form of species egalitarianism. He argues that non-human animals and humans should be given the same moral consideration because we can suffer equally. The criterion he uses applies to both groups equally, we might say. But Singer goes further and argues for animal rights as well. Singer argues that the sorts of moral consideration that animals deserve is a strong one, just like we would attribute to a human being. So it's not just that he's a zoocentrist, and it's not just that he's a species egalitarian. He is very much someone in support of animal rights and the idea that animals are owed direct moral consideration that should not easily be overridden. And Singer seems to think that discriminating against animals on the basis of species alone would be to fall prey to speciesism of some sort or another. But Singer says that doesn't mean that animals should be given the same exact rights as human beings. He points out that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to talk about, say, like a dog's right to free speech or a dog's right to vote or something like that. And non-human animals have very different capacities compared to human beings. So while animals ought to be given the same moral consideration, that doesn't mean that they should have the exact same rights overall. Instead, they should merely be considered in the same way that we should be considering other human beings. And I think that we all make all sorts of mistakes on this sort of thing. We mistreat people at a distance in a variety of ways. Not just all of us are horrible for eating meat or anything like that. But Singer's view does have some rather strong implications. Uh, for one, it immediately suggests that we ought to live a sort of vegetarian lifestyle, that we ought to not have nearly so much of a meat and dairy industry as we currently do, and so on. But it also has some negative implications, some objections that can be raised to this sorts of view, largely because of the theoretical costs associated with it, the implications of the view that may either be absurd philosophically or just may simply lead to conclusions about what's right and wrong that we shouldn't endorse. For one, some theorists point out that some of Singer's conclusions aren't actually warranted by the evidence. As I just mentioned, Singer argues that vegetarianism is something that we ought to endorse because of the equal moral status of animals, of non-human animals. But uh, some point out that it's not actually required. So long as we could have some sort of painless meat industry, one in which animals don't suffer as they die or for whatever reason, well, then that would satisfy his criterion. And that would, appropriately treat things with moral status just as we might worry about or be okay with outside of the current meat industry. Similarly, experimentation on animals, which is often a sensitive subject for animal rights activists, or something that they see as something that ought to be abolished. Singer is one of these. Uh, if some sort of painless or non suffering form of experimentation could be developed, then it could still be morally justifiable. And for both animal rights activists and those against that sort of position, this can be very much a theoretical cost for either being, well, ridiculous or not far enough. I guess I'm not phrasing that correctly, but um, regardless, the conclusions of his view might not be warranted or supported well or acceptable given the sort of positions we're talking about. Additionally, Singer's explanation might be found faulty. As a moral theory, Singer's giving an explanation for why certain things are right or wrong, or why animals are worthy of moral consideration. Namely, that they can suffer, that they meet a certain criterion that we ought to be using for human beings as well. But there may be good reasons for not adopting that sort of criterion. If we think that some sort of a non consequentialist theory is correct, or if we think that using that criterion itself has massive theoretical costs, that if we use suffering as a criterion for moral status, and if we use suffering and happiness as criteria for what's right and wrong, then there may be instances of massive suffering that are morally justifiable in Singer's view, so long as it relieves enough suffering or pain globally speaking. And that just seems mistaken to an awful lot of people. It seems wrong to allow the suffering of a few for the good of many, just because there are a few doesn't mean that it's not important not to have that sort of thing. So, again, it's worth noting that these are costs, these are possible objections to Singer's view, not automatic and definitive reasons to not endorse it. But they are things that are worth considering, and they're things to worry about and debate as we go through and think about these sorts of issues. Now, that about covers the overview of this sort of topic. Next time, we'll shift gears a little bit and look at a bit more of the environmental side of the moral status, environmental ethics issue. But in the meantime, I want you to go ahead and try and reflect on some of what we've read, think about these sorts of things, tackle the journal if you haven't already, and start taking a look at the next round of readings, which is both general overviews of ecological holism and a selection from Aldo Leopold's The Land Ethic, a well known essay about the moral status of the land itself being something that we should worry about and concern ourselves with. But until then, hope you guys are having a